July 18, 1944. A narrow road outside Cagny, France, 3 kilometers south of Caen. The dust hung in the air like a curtain of fine talc, kicked up by the treads of tanks moving through the summer heat. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in the commander's hatch of his Panther Ausf, binoculars pressed against his eyes, surveying the horizon where the British and Canadian lines had been probing for days. The Bocage country was behind them now, replaced by more open terrain that favored his long 75mm gun. Weber had been a tanker since 1941, had fought through the mud of Russia and the sand of North Africa before being transferred to Normandy. He knew armor. He knew tactics. He knew the mathematics of tank warfare. Angles of deflection, rates of closure, the geometry of kill zones. What he did not know, what he could not yet comprehend, was the arithmetic of American industry. As his Panther idled behind a stone wall, engine ticking in the heat, Weber spotted movement to the northwest. Tanks. Many tanks. They came in a column that seemed to have no end, a procession of identical silhouettes moving like a mechanical river across the French countryside. Shermans. Always Shermans. Weber had destroyed 4 of them the previous week. His crew had painted small white rings on the barrel to mark each kill. But for every Sherman they knocked out, 3 more appeared. It was as if the Americans were manufacturing them faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. Weber lowered his binoculars and felt something he had not felt since the early days of Barbarossa. Not fear, exactly, but a creeping awareness that the rules had changed, that the war had become something his training had not prepared him for. For 2 years, German tank crews had operated under an assumption that was both tactical and psychological. Quality would triumph over quantity. The Panther and Tiger tanks were superior machines, engineered with Teutonic precision, armed with guns that could penetrate enemy armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. A single well-positioned Panther could hold a road junction against a platoon of Shermans. A Tiger could dominate an entire sector. German tankers were trained to think of themselves as an elite, the modern cavalry, the tip of the spear. Their machines were expensive, complex, difficult to produce, but devastating in combat. The American Sherman, by contrast, was dismissed as crude, under-armored, and undergunned. German crews called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, mocking how quickly they ignited when hit. Intelligence reports reinforced this contempt, describing the Sherman as a mass-produced compromise, designed for speed and reliability rather than battlefield dominance. What those same intelligence reports failed to adequately convey, or what German commanders failed to internalize, was the scale of American production. The United States was not building hundreds of tanks. It was building tens of thousands. The Sherman tank was never intended to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was intended to be everywhere on the battlefield. American industrial planners, drawing on lessons from the First World War and observing early German successes in Poland and France, made a calculated decision. Produce a tank that was good enough, mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, and simple enough that semi-skilled labor could assemble it in vast quantities. The M4 Sherman embodied this philosophy completely. It used a proven engine derived from aircraft radials or commercial truck power plants. Its transmission was straightforward. Its armor was welded or cast in shapes that simplified manufacturing. Its 75mm gun was adequate against most targets and fired a useful high-explosive shell for infantry support. The Sherman was not a technical marvel. It was an industrial miracle. By 1944, American factories were producing Shermans at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal, built from scratch in 1940, covered 113 acres and employed over 10,000 workers operating in 3 shifts around the clock. Ford's facility in Michigan, Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio, Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington, each plant became a component in a vast machine dedicated to a single purpose, overwhelming the enemy not with superior technology, but with inexhaustible supply. Friedrich Weber did not know about the Detroit tank arsenal as he watched the Sherman column advance that July afternoon. He did not know that between 1942 and 1945, American industry would produce 49,234 Sherman tanks in various configurations, a number so large it represented more tanks than Germany would produce of all types during the entire war. He did not know that for every Panther rolling off the production lines in Germany, approximately 6,000 in total, the Americans were building 8 Shermans. What he did know was what he could see through his periscope. An enemy that kept coming, that absorbed losses and replaced them faster than he could inflict them, that treated tanks the way Germany had once treated infantry, as expendable assets in a war of attrition. The realization was disorienting. German doctrine had always emphasized the decisive engagement, the knockout blow, the concentrated force that shattered enemy formations and created opportunities for exploitation. But how do you deliver a decisive blow to an opponent who can afford to lose decisively and return the next day with fresh equipment? The production numbers told a story that transcended mere statistics. In 1943 alone, American factories delivered 29,497 tanks of all types. German production for the same year totaled 12,063, and that figure included assault guns and tank destroyers, not just main battle tanks. The disparity was even starker when examined month by month. In January 1944, American plants completed 1,854 medium tanks, almost all of them Shermans. German factories in the same month produced 6 Torturi 50, 14 Panzer Vs, Panthers, and Tigers combined. By June 1944, as Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy, the United States had a reserve of thousands of Sherman tanks waiting in depots, ready to replace battlefield losses. Germany, by contrast, was cannibalizing damaged vehicles for spare parts and rushing partially trained crews into action aboard tanks that had not been properly tested. The Sherman became a symbol, not of American technical prowess, but of something more fundamental and more terrifying to the Wehrmacht: American abundance. It represented an industrial capacity so vast that it could afford waste, could absorb inefficiency, could replace losses at a rate that made traditional calculations of attrition meaningless. German tankers experienced this abundance as a kind of psychological warfare. Lieutenant Hans Becker, a Tiger commander in Normandy, wrote in a letter to his sister that summer, "We destroy them, and still they come. Yesterday we knocked out 7 Shermans at a crossroads. 7! And by evening there were 5 more in the same position, fresh from the depots, as if the ones we killed had never existed." How do you fight an enemy who does not feel his losses? Becker's question was not rhetorical. It struck at the heart of German strategic assumptions. The Wehrmacht had been designed to fight short, decisive campaigns in which superior training and equipment would compensate for numerical inferiority. That doctrine had worked in Poland, in France, in the early months of Barbarossa. But by 1944, the war had metastasized into exactly the kind of grinding, attritional struggle that German planners had hoped to avoid. And in a war of attrition, the side with deeper reserves would prevail. The Sherman's omnipresence reshaped battlefield behavior on both sides. German tank commanders became cautious, calculating whether engaging a Sherman column was worth revealing their position. A Panther might kill 5 Shermans before being destroyed, but if those 5 Shermans were replaced within 48 hours, and the Panther was not, who had won the exchange? American crews, meanwhile, developed tactics that exploited their numerical advantage. They learned to advance in overwatching pairs, to use flanking maneuvers that forced German tanks to choose between targets, to call in artillery and air support that German forces could not match. The Sherman was not invincible, but it was persistent. It was patient. It could afford to lose battles as long as it won the campaign. And underlying all of this was the constant, grinding reality that every German tanker learned to dread. For every Panther, Tiger, or Panzer IV that was destroyed, the replacement might take weeks or months to arrive, if it arrived at all. For every Sherman destroyed, the replacement was already on a ship crossing the Atlantic or rolling off an assembly line in Detroit. The production process itself was a marvel of systematization. Henry Ford's mass production techniques, refined over decades of automobile manufacturing, were applied wholesale to tank production. The Detroit tank arsenal used a moving assembly line nearly half a mile long. Tanks moved through the facility on a track system, with workers adding components at each station: turret assembly, suspension installation, engine mounting, track fitting. The process took 18 hours from start to finish for a complete tank. Contrast this with German production, where tanks were often hand-fitted, with individual craftsmen adjusting components to achieve precise tolerances. A Panther might be mechanically superior to a Sherman, but it took 3 times as long to build. The German approach produced excellence. The American approach produced inevitability. Friedrich Weber's Panther fired 3 times that afternoon outside Cagny, destroying 2 Shermans and forcing a third to withdraw. By nightfall, his crew had retreated to a fallback position, conserving ammunition and fuel, both of which were growing scarce. Weber wrote in his diary that evening, an entry that would later be recovered from his effects after the war: "We are drowning in Shermans. There is no other word for it. Drowning. They come in waves, and we stand against the tide. I have killed more enemy tanks in Normandy than in all my time in Russia, and yet we are losing ground every day." The Americans do not fight like soldiers. They fight like factory workers, efficiently, without passion, replacing every loss from some bottomless inventory we cannot comprehend. I begin to understand why our generals are afraid. The Sherman's symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. To German soldiers, it represented the gulf between their own dwindling resources and Allied plenty. Captured American supply depots revealed stockpiles that seemed almost obscene: crates of spare parts, barrels of fuel, ammunition in quantities that German units had not seen since 1942. Aide Panzer crewman captured near St. Lo reported to interrogators that his unit had been operating on quarter rations and limited fuel for 2 weeks before being overrun. When he saw the American supply area, he said he understood for the first time that Germany had lost the war. It was not a matter of courage or tactics or even technology. It was mathematics. Germany was being outproduced, and in modern war, production was destiny. By the time the war ended, American industry had delivered not just 49,234 Shermans, but an entire ecosystem of support. For every tank, there were spare engines, replacement tracks, extra transmissions, ammunition by the thousands of rounds. American logistics units could perform engine swaps in the field that German crews would have required a factory to accomplish. Sherman tanks knocked out in combat were often recovered, repaired, and returned to service within days. German tanks, once disabled, were frequently abandoned because the resources to recover and repair them did not exist. The Sherman became a metaphor for the American way of war: pragmatic, resource-intensive, relentless. It was not the weapon of heroes. It was the weapon of a system, an industrial democracy that could turn its civilian economy into a war machine without collapsing under the strain. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was cumulative and corrosive. Veteran tankers who had survived Russia, who had knocked out dozens of Soviet T-34s and KV-1s, found themselves overwhelmed not by superior enemy skill, but by sheer numerical superiority. The rules they had learned: achieve firing position first, engage at maximum range, withdraw and reposition, became less effective when the enemy could afford to saturate an area with tanks, accepting losses that would have crippled a German formation. Morale reports from panzer divisions in France during the summer of 1944 document increasing fatalism. Crews spoke of feeling like target practice for an endless procession of Shermans. Some referred to the American tanks as the plague, an affliction that could not be cured, only endured. Friedrich Weber survived the war. His Panther was destroyed in August 1944 near Falaise, though he and most of his crew escaped the encirclement. He spent the final months of the war in a hodgepodge unit, equipped with whatever vehicles could be scraped together. A Panzer IV, briefly a captured Sherman, finally an obsolete Panzer III used for training. After the war, he returned to Hamburg, worked as a machinist, and rarely spoke about his experiences. In an interview conducted in 1978, he was asked what surprised him most about fighting the Americans. His answer was immediate. The tanks. Always the tanks. We joked that they grew them in fields like wheat, that Roosevelt had discovered a way to plant tank seeds. It was not a funny joke. There is nothing funny about fighting an enemy who has so much that he does not count the cost. We counted everything, every shell, every liter of fuel, every replacement crewman. They counted nothing. That is the difference between winning and losing. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. It was arguably not even the best American tank. The M26 Pershing, arriving late in the war, was superior in nearly every measurable way. But the Sherman was the tank that mattered, because it was the tank that arrived in numbers sufficient to change the equation of armored warfare. It proved that in industrial war, adequacy at scale defeats excellence in scarcity. It demonstrated that democratic capitalism, when fully mobilized, could outproduce authoritarian efficiency. And it taught the Wehrmacht a lesson that generations of military theorists would study: that logistics is strategy, that production is power, and that the army with the longest supply line often has the shortest casualty list. On that July afternoon outside Cannes, as Friedrich Weber watched another column of Shermans rumble past his position, he was witnessing more than a tactical problem. He was witnessing the visible manifestation of a strategic truth: that America had turned war into an industrial process, and in that process, the Sherman was both the input and the output, both the means and the message. 50,000 Shermans. The number itself was a weapon, a form of psychological warfare that did not require firing a shot. It said, we can afford to lose. We can afford to learn. We can afford to make mistakes and correct them. Can you? The answer, written in the rubble of the Third Reich and the surrender documents signed in a railway car and aboard a battleship, was no. Germany could not afford to lose. It could not replace what it destroyed. It could not match production with production. The Sherman, ordinary and ubiquitous, became the steel embodiment of American abundance, rolling across Europe in numbers that transformed quantity into its own quality, proving that sometimes the weapon that wins is not the one that kills the most enemies, but the one that arrives when needed, where needed, for as long as needed. In the arithmetic of total war, 50,000 was not just a number. It was an answer to every question the Wehrmacht had failed to ask.